when I woke up, very confused. She said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
You just sensed that it was out there.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed to push ourselves even farther.
This is On the X, an IRONCLAD original. Welcome to On the X. My guest today is Steve Rinella, a hunter, outdoorsman, conservationist, and author who has dedicated his life to exploring and sharing the beauty of the natural world. He's the founder and host of MeatEater, a Netflix series and podcast that blends hunting, fishing, and conservation with deep storytelling and respect for the wild. Steve is also a best-selling author, having written books like American Buffalo and MeatEater, as well as cookbooks reflecting his passion for sustainable hunting and food preparation. He has introduced countless people to the rewards and responsibilities of living off the land through his work, and advocates for conservation efforts to ensure that future generations can experience the same. And he has a new show on the History Channel called Hunting History. So here we go with Steve Rinella on the X. Talking about the show, because the show is brand new, right? Just came out in January.
That's right. It launched, late January. It's called Hunting History. There's kind of a connection to, the name Hunting History led some people to believe that it was about hunting, which makes sense because I've done a hunting show for many, many years, over 10 years. I've done a hunting show called MeatEater. And the first guy, one of our very first camera guys on MeatEater was a guy named Mo Fallon. And after he worked on MeatEater a little bit, and he was working on the Bourdain shows back then too, because we were with the same production company. So Mo went on to produce all these, to film and then produce all these Bourdain episodes. And then after Bourdain's death, Mo started working on other projects. And then it wound up being that he and I came back together on this in an interesting way, where we were looking for a showrunner to do this History Channel show, and Mo was free and came on to work on the show. So on a day-to-day basis, I've been very involved with Mo, but the idea had an inception long before that, where the production company I'm working with on this is Warm Springs Production. And a friend of mine who I duck hunt with and stuff owns Warm Springs, Mark Pierce. And he and I just started talking about, different things that'd be fun to do. He'd done a lot of work for History Channel over the years. And we just started talking about these wilderness mysteries and outdoor mysteries, which a lot of the things are things you kind of bump into when you're out running around outside,
Sure.
We did one, we've done a couple that touched on, we filmed a couple in Alaska on things that I've long been interested in about Alaska. And for me, it was like a real way to, I wasn't looking to get into, I didn't like purposely want to do something that was outside of hunting and fishing, but it was just an interesting way to explore another aspect of my writing, because I've always written about history, but I've never really done a show about history. So it's cool. Like my first book was about history. My second book was about history. So it was just a good way to bring my research and writing projects into TV, because for a long time, those things sat kind of side by side.
Yeah.
And they didn't come together,
So I haven't seen an episode of this. Is it sort of like a Expedition X or Expedition Unknown kind of Josh Gates type of thing? Have you ever seen that show?
No, I haven't seen that.
Okay.
In it, each one is free. Each episode is freestanding. So we look at eight different mysteries. There's some things that bind them all together. They all are set in a wilderness or out like a relative to every other place, kind of a wild setting, right? And they all have an outdoor element. They all have an element of which is kind of the theme of all of my work, which is about like human interactions with the natural world, human interactions with nature. So some of these stories, the oldest story we look into is something that was maybe 15 to 20,000 year old question, which was who were the first Americans?
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
When did the first Americans come? Where did they come from? What were the circumstances of their arrival? So that's a really old one. The most recent one we worked on is like, what is actually up with when someone says that they have a cattle mutilation? Like, what does that mean? What is up with cattle mutilations? So we go meet with some ranchers who've lost cattle to cattle mutilations in Oregon. And that's kind of like still an ongoing thing. Like next year, the year after, whatever, at some point, you're going to find a newspaper article where some investigator expresses like being stumped by why these cows are killed and cut in a very peculiar fashion. So that's like an ongoing mystery. So from 20,000 years ago to now, we found these things, and they might hit at, we did one that's, 400 years old. We did one that's 300 years old. We did one that's about 50 years old, right? And another thing that binds, there's two other things that bind them despite all these disparate ages, is they're mostly things that when people hear about it, like when just a regular audience member hears about it, there will usually be something in the back of their head that makes them feel like they know something about that story.
Right.
Or they're like, they'll be like, I heard of that, right? Like I grew up, I knew the outlines of what happened with the Donner Party.
Yeah.
I knew
Yep.
the outline of the lost colony of Roanoke. Like I knew, yeah, something or another, a bunch of people vanished, or with Donner, oh, I remember a bunch of people ate each other. So we're looking for things that would have that, where you'd come to it with a little bit of a pre-awareness. And we look for things where the narrative is still changing because people are still researching and investigating, where our understanding of it constantly evolves. Why, if you go back to the first Americans, why would our understanding of the first Americans still be evolving? Well, work in genetics, linguistics, all these things, like our understandings constantly change. There's a lot of geology that changes our understanding of the air and time, right? So these are all things where if you understood it 10 years ago, the understanding might have changed by now.
Yeah.
So wilderness, ongoing mystery that still evolves, some level of pre-awareness. And we found 8 things like that.
Nice. I'm definitely going to check out this show now, man. This is like right up my alley of stuff that I like.
Oh, is that right?
Oh yeah, totally. Like I mentioned Expedition Unknown. I love that show. And two of the things you mentioned, he does a show on the Donner Party. He does a show on Roanoke. There's actually, I think, a couple on those. Yeah. So, I mean, that show taught me a lot more about those things. So without giving too much away, there's a couple things in there that I'm curious of. So where are we at now with first people in the Americas? How far back have we pushed that at this point?
That's a great question. I first became interested in that question, being like, who were the first Americans, right? Which when you ask who are the first Americans, it carries with it a handful of questions that travel with that, being like, when you say like who are the first Americans, you're kind of saying, when did humans first arrive in the New World, or when did humans first arrive in the Americas? How did they get here? Where did they come from, and where did they go? I really became interested in that question many years ago when I was working on a book about buffalo. I'd found a buffalo skull long, over 20 years ago, and wound up doing a whole book about that animal. It's called American Buffalo in Search of a Lost Icon. And in that story, there's on the subject of buffalo skulls, there's just some interesting things that have emerged about buffalo skulls. As part of my research, I went to a site called the Folsom site in Folsom, New Mexico. And it was a place where around 12,000 years ago, some hunters killed 20-some bison in a box canyon. Perhaps they kind of drove them up into a box canyon and trapped them up in there and killed them all in a big pile. Butchered them. It seems like they hauled their hides away with the tails still intact because the tail bones weren't in the bone bed. Seems like they removed the tongues because you could see cut marks on the lower jaw lines. And when they found that site, it kind of caused this almost like religious controversy at the time. They found it in the 1920s because it raised the question of, here you had this, like, it was an extinct form of bison. They weren't like the ones we have today. They were a little bit different. It was the first time where you had human artifacts, stone spear points, mixed in with Ice Age fauna, mixed in with Ice Age bones. And it caused people to sort of reckon with this idea that humans had been in the New World a lot longer than they had expected. Like if you took a strictly biblical view of the timeline, like a literal view of the
Yeah.
timeline, it didn't, there wasn't room for humans to have been running around here during the Ice Age, right? So it spawned this whole question of who were they, where'd they come from, how'd they get here? For most of my adult life, the narrative has gone that during the Ice Age is coming, they come up and down, up and down. You have like glacial maximums and everything melts. We're kind of in a melt period right now. Then you have a glacial maximum. Other melt periods weren't different than the melt period we're in right now. And they would be punctuated with these maximums. I mean, these things play out over tens of thousands of years. But the idea was so much ice at a time, so much ice was built up in glaciers that the Bering Land Bridge was the size of Texas.
Right.
Meaning,
It's not really a bridge.
Yeah, if you walked from Siberia to Alaska, it wasn't like you were on like a little narrow.
Right.
You were like, it was Texas.
Yeah.
And generations probably lived and died on this thing without having any idea that they were on a bridge to anywhere.
Right.
They came across and they were stuck in Alaska because all that ice prevented you from going south. And then eventually this thing called the ice-free corridor opened up and it kind of melted in the middle and people were able to go down and they probably entered the American Great Plains around Edmonton, Alberta and spilled out onto the plains. And the idea was that these were mammoth hunters. And then they very, very, very quickly, like with shocking speed, populated North and South America, being that they had unbelievable resources available to them because it had never been hunted. No one was there.
Right.
There's no warfare. There's no competition for food. You go to a valley, walk up to stuff, spirit, it had never seen a person before. You jump to the next valley, walk up, spirit, it had never seen a person before. Phenomenal birth rates, and all of a sudden, like, whap, people all over North and South America. And these were like Clovis, the Clovis culture.
Yep.
That theory has kind of gradually fallen apart, or it's crumbled a little bit. Like there's a really old site in Chile called Mesa Verde. There's now a very old site in the headwaters of the Columbia River. There seemed to be that they were being occupied by humans before this ice-free corridor opened up. And now they're kind of wondering, like, was the ice-free corridor really even how we envisioned it to be? And the current fashionable idea is that rather than being like these sort of interior grassland mammoth hunters, the first people to kind of come down and step foot in the lower 48 were seafaring people that came down the coast. Perhaps almost certainly from the same area, coming from Siberia. But they came down the coast exploiting these super rich marine environments. It's become to be known as the Kelp Highway. We're basically from the Aleutians down to Southern California. You had this band of like extremely rich fisheries, shellfish resources, and people in boats could just cruise quite contentedly, very well fed, relying on fish and shellfish resources. And then maybe established themselves along the coast, the Pacific coast, and then started following those major river courses into the interior. There used to be the idea that the first people were that Clovis was maybe like a culture that arrived here, but it seems that the Clovis culture was something that developed here on its own, off of these other more distant people that came here first. Someone that really works on this for a living would probably be annoyed by my explanation. No, they'd feel like they wanted to add 3 hours worth of ifs, ands.
Of course.
Ifs, ands.
But I'm just looking for I had never heard that. I mean, I'd always heard the kind of, walk over the land bridge. Got it. It's not that's in your book, right? So I read American Buffalo, where it's like,
American Buffalo. I pushed the ice-free corridor idea. Yeah.
Yeah. But how long ago are we talking about then? Like, how far is this pushing it back?
Well, that's where you get into a really good question, because they used to think researchers used to have a little bit of an idea on when this happened, because they were trying to look at when would when would, in big chunks of time, when would the situation have been right? Meaning that the Bering Land Bridge was open, that it was a water-free travelway. And then two, so that would have needed to happen at one point in time. And then you would have had to have a moment when you could travel from northern Alaska to the lower 48 because you had this big band of ice that ran across the continent. So they would try to juggle like, well, one set of conditions would allow people to come and another set of conditions would allow people to migrate southward. So we drew our timelines like that. We also drew our timelines on what was the oldest sites. So if you had, for a time, you had like your oldest sites were like the Clovis type site, the Folsom type site in New Mexico on the Great Plains. So people thought, well, that's the oldest stuff. Like the oldest stuff we found must be the oldest stuff, which is logical. But then for a while, it was like the oldest place we knew about was in southern Chile, Chilean Patagonia. Okay. If people came from Siberia and the oldest site you have is in Chilean Patagonia, there's a lot of stuff missing.
Yeah. Is that like, what's it called?
In those thousands
Catan or
of
something?
miles.
Something like that.
What's that?
That site, is it Catan or, I saw a
It's
thing
called
on
Monteverde.
Okay. All right. It's a different site. So I'm thinking of something differently. So
why are we not finding any of these sites? If they were on the coast for a long time, it's, much of it's underwater.
yeah, sure.
Right.
Yep.
So it'd be that like, I think over time it's become that so much is missing that you can't look at what you have as being like evidence of when people got here,
Yeah.
And we always say like it used to be like these people be like, oh, it was about 13,000 years ago, but then you find something a little older, then you find something a little older. And basically you gotta be like, what are the odds you found the oldest thing?
Right.
The next question you jump into is when was anybody even in Siberia? Like if they came from there, like what sites do we have in Siberia? And then you start getting this idea, and people kind of throw their hands in the air now. It could be there could have been. You wouldn't be crazy sounding to throw out that maybe 20,000 years ago there was someone along the coast. There were people living along the coast.
Yeah.
This
it's funny reading your stuff. You strike me as someone who is, you're almost like an amateur anthropologist in a lot of ways. And I'm wondering if did that evolve out of your interest in hunting, or were they completely mutually exclusive? Was it the other way around? Is it just, you know what I mean? Like, did it come out of that where you're so interested in sort of hunting that carried forward with this sort of history of the animals and that led into anthropology? Is that the way it evolved?
definitely came out of hunting and trapping. Yeah. All I read about when I was little, I just wanted to, I wanted to be a professional trapper. Hunting was very important. And I just read about any kind of old hunting and trapping stuff I could find.
Yeah.
The older the better. I used to check out and recheck out and recheck out and recheck out this book called Trap Lines North, and it was about like fur trappers in Canada in the 1920s. Anything I could find about any kind of old people that lived off the land, old trappers, I just read about it. So I was always interested in kind of like in my continent, I later got a little bit interested in South America, but mostly like who were the first people to get after it around where I lived, and like how did those stories go? And a lot of kids know that they want to be like Daniel Boone. People hear that name and they feel like they understand something about him. Many people don't know what he actually was, but they know that he was a frontiersman.
Yeah.
And so I would just kind of wonder, what actually did he do? Like what was his life? What made him what he was? Why do we know about him today? And so I'd read up on that, and I was just curious about that kind of stuff. So as I became a writer, I continued to focus on looking back on it. I guess the way I define it is I focused on ways in which, like, an exploration of how humans interact with nature or how humans interact with the natural world. if I was going to take all my work and put it into like a pile,
Yeah.
and I had to call that something, I think I would call it probably an exploration of that. Um, but it's always, yeah, at its base, I've always been curious about hunting, hunting and hunters. Um, you can't read about hunting in the future, but if you could, I'd read about that too.
So, hey, so to that point about like the history of this stuff, do you wish, like, if you could do it, do you wish you were like born at a different time where it was like, there weren't, you know what I'm saying? Like 200 years ago or whatever.
100%, man. My dad used to always say, my dad, he knew the chronology of American hunters pretty well. And I remember he used to say that I was born 200 years too late. And I remember thinking I was born maybe about 150 years, 175 years would have been nice. Close to 200 years too late. Just because I wanted to be a trapper,
Yeah.
So I was born in 74. I started trapping in 84. Now, in just catching muskrats when I was 10, there was a big fur boom. Like fur prices shot up in 1978. And there's this big fur boom that ran till 82. So this 4-year like mega fur boom. When I say a fur boom, I mean like all fur got valuable.
Mm-hmm.
I started trapping at the tail end of that, and it kind of had a slow drop off coming out of 82. But dudes around where I grew up, guys were like quitting their jobs to trap. Or guys would they would like go on unemployment in the fall to trap, and people were like buying brand new pickup trucks off trapping mink, muskrats, fox.
Yeah.
Like people were making money trapping in my area. And so even though that boom was over, I was real informed by that boom, and just trapped through a long decline in fur prices. There have been other little fur booms since then where like a handful of select items might get super valuable. But I was like chasing that, and I thought if you could make a living trapping, why would you do anything else? That's what I would do, is I'd be a trapper. And so my dad became aware of, he felt that he was very encouraging about being a trapper, and later very encouraging about being a writer, but he just felt like you had missed the boat. And he didn't think you'd missed the boat by not being around in 1980. He thought you meant you missed the boat by not being around in 1810.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like you missed the main boat a long time ago.
Just on your dad real quick. Did I read this right? Was your dad in World War II?
Yeah, my dad was born in 1924. He was 50 years old. He got into the Army when he was 17. I have a lot of questions I'd like to clarify with him if he was still alive, but he told me 100 times he joined at 17. He said his mom signed for him. I don't know how true that is, but it makes sense when you line it all up. He was sent to Biloxi for boot camp.
Yeah.
Went from Biloxi, got moved and put on a boat, got sent to Morocco.
Yep.
Sat in Morocco for a long time. Got moved down for Anzio.
Yeah, right.
The Anzio landing.
Yep.
And then they worked their way north from there. And he wound up even staying late. Like at the end of the war, he stayed a while and was stationed up, and they were taking all that material in figuring out what to return, what to give to like Allied powers, what to scrap.
Yep.
And he said he said he had a little scooter and drove it around, and it would be like certain stuff, they just demolish and whatever, and worked on that project for a while, and then eventually made his way back home, man. And
that was
made his way back home and hunting and fishing.
That was so wild to me, just because when I'm reading that, I was like, because you and I are basically the same age. You said you're born in 74. I'm born in 75, yep. So same age. My parents are literal boomers, right? Like they are the first generation baby boomers. They were born in 1946, 47. And when I read that, I'm like, wow, he must have, like your dad must have had you when he was like in his mid 50s.
Had me at 50 years of age.
Okay. Yeah.
So, but check this out. This is kind of where this is wild. My dad got his girlfriend pregnant before leaving for the war.
Okay.
So I have a half brother that's in his 80s.
Oh, holy shit. Wow.
So my dad talked about coming home from the war. My dad got home from the war, and he says he's got like, at that point, he's got like a 2.5-year-old or something.
Yeah. Whoa.
He said, I remember I walked in the door and my kid, who I'd never seen, my kid is standing on a chair and said, "That's my dad."
Holy shit. Wow. So
Yeah, it's hilarious.
when you were growing up,
You know-
go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask on that. The military ever an option for you? Did you ever think about that? Did your dad talk about it as a kid?
Dude, I wanted to, man. I did the ASVAB. I wanted to try to go into the Green Berets and did the ASVAB. And my dad, and I had the Army recruiters over the house a couple times, and my dad was very opposed to joining the military. He said, it's funny to tell, I always tell my friends in the service, I always tell them my dad said this. He said that, like, there's no war. He's like, if there's a war, sign up. But if there's not a war, what are you gonna do?
Yeah.
That was his take on it. And he did not want, you know what's funny, man? Like, I never talk about this to anybody. It just doesn't come up. Not that I'm trying to hide it, but I remember a thing that really pissed my dad off about the recruiters is that we're sitting there at my kitchen table and the recruiters asked me what I like to do. Okay. And at the time I was getting interested in writing as well. And I just said, like, stuff I'm interested in. I said, I'm interested in hunting and I'm kind of interested in writing. And this recruiter, I mean, you know, he's doing his job, man, but he paints out this sort of, he starts talking about all the good hunting on bases, on military bases, which, you know, I got some friends that are base stationed here and there, like friends of mine at, what's that, McCord, that joint base in Seattle.
Yep.
I got buddies there that do good on deer or do good on ducks. Guys down at Fort Bragg, they had some deer hunting opportunities. So it's not crazy, but he was sort of painting out like all this amazing hunting on military bases. And he also pointed out like a lot of writing opportunities within the military. And I remember he talked about stars and stripes. And my dad was offended because he felt that it was he felt that it was quite misleading.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, your first years are not going to be that.
No.
And he felt like a little insulted. He felt that it was misleading. And he like told these guys, I don't want to have this conversation with my kid.
Yeah.
It was just like, I don't know. He just didn't want it, man. He didn't want it. As proud as he was like real proud. You know, always talked about it, told everybody about the war. I grew up around Vietnam guys. All my buddies' dads are Vietnam guys. My dad would explain, he's like, my experience, you know, he'd say like, my experience was so different than these guys. And most of his friends were Vietnam guys, you know? And he'd be like, he'd always talk about, we were heroes. You know, we came home and we wanted a job. You got the job. You know, if you weren't a GI, you were going to get kicked out of the job to make room for a GI. Always talked about like the difference of how he was received compared to how Vietnam guys, the reality they lived. Was real proud of his service, but just didn't want it. Didn't want it.
Wow.
Yeah, I'd like to, you know, it's one of the many things if he was around, like just like if I could do an exit interview, I would ask him more about that, you know.
Yeah.
You know?
But you just ultimately decided not for me, not going to go that route. Obviously.
No, I didn't. And I do regret it in a lot of ways. You know, it'd be like everything would be different. I wouldn't be sitting here right now. Something different would have happened.
Yeah.
I encourage my kids to, and my wife will tell my kids, like, be careful. Your dad's trying to live out his own. He's trying to like live out his own regrets through you guys.
Yeah. Before you did all of this stuff, writing and shows and everything, were you able to like make a living as a hunter, or were you doing something else alongside of that?
No. Man, as hard as I trapped, like even so when I started, I wasn't going to go to college. I went to college only at the last minute. I walked down to the community college. I always tell friends of mine, they don't think it could be true, but I feel like it's true. There's some test you're supposed to take to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've never taken the ASVAB, the military test. I don't remember taking whatever the hell it was, SATs or something.
Oh, SATs, yeah, for sure. I mean, now they have the ACTs.
I always tell people,
well.
I don't think I took that. I don't think I took SATs. I later took the graduate school test, but I don't remember taking SATs. But I know that like at the end of the summer, I went down to the community college and wrote a check. I'm not kidding you. I wrote a check for $600 for a semester of community college and took all night classes so I could trap all day long. because that was the first time, because I was out of high school, it was the first time I could just trap all day and not have to do any school. And I'd go to school at 6 p.m, 4 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
And I did 2 years of college that way. And even then, trapping that hard, you couldn't make any money at it. So I did firewood. I used to cut and split firewood.
Yeah.
I'd cut and split in the summer
Yeah.
and sell seasoned wood. Once you got around Christmas and later, I'd sell seasoned firewood. I did tree work, like tree surgeon work. I started working for a buddy of mine who's a millwright, installing equipment. Always did the trades. When I was in graduate school, I went back to tree work, topping trees, trimming trees, felling trees. Stayed with that. And then it was probably around, by 2000, I was making half my money writing. And then within a couple of years, I never did any kind of other work ever again.
Okay.
I made all my money writing, but it was like not much. I remember you'd be below. I'm always annoyed when people talk about being poor if they don't have kids. Like, if you don't have kids, you can't really be poor. You're like, you know what I mean? It's like you just didn't have much cash, but you're not poor.
Yeah.
I would just quite contentedly make do with not much because I had zero responsibilities.
Right.
I didn't have any responsibilities. And it was more important to me to like sort of have that, having any kind of material wealth wasn't as important to me as it was to be able to say that I just wrote for a living.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that what was funny is when I went to graduate school, with some very, very promising, really promising writers, like extremely talented individuals.
Yeah.
I went to a competitive program, and you'd again and again see these like really, over the years that followed that, you'd see these really talented, gifted people not make it in the field that they wanted to be in because they couldn't handle that uncertainty and they couldn't handle that period of being broke. And so they would get seduced into other occupations.
Yeah.
They'd get seduced into a paycheck.
Right. Sure.
And then you get to where you could never get back to it.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And because I didn't have, for whatever reason, I just didn't have any and I never had any sort of family expectation about what I'm supposed to be doing. So I was just able to spend a bunch of years living in my brother's basement, whatever. Just trying to make do without feeling like I was living anything other than a dream, a perfect dream, And eventually I got to where I was like legitimately, I got to where I was like a solidly middle-class person, but it took a long time.
Yeah. On the X is proudly presented by Mechanics Wear. Known for their durability and comfort, Mechanics Wear gloves are made from top quality materials offering protection against impacts, cuts, and abrasions. They feature advanced breathability and moisture-wicking technology to keep hands cool and dry during any task. Designed with precision, these gloves provide a secure grip and flexibility, helping users work more efficiently and safely. They've certainly been my personal go-to glove for decades. Mechanics Wear gloves are available at most retailers, on mechanicswear.com, and on GSA Advantage. What made you want to be a writer? Was that separate? Was it like, I guess the question I'm asking there is a little bit of just straight on the nose with that. But was it like, I want to be a writer to support hunting and like tell that story? Or was it a completely separate thing where it's like, I just really like writing as well and I want to do that?
It was two things. There was the how I knew, it was how I got into writing and why I was drawn to it. I got into writing by a teacher who's still alive named Robert Heaton. And when I was in high school, he really encouraged kids to like write about what they knew in regular English. He would make room for it. He'd want to hear about what your experiences were, and he gave you opportunities to write about what you knew. And he saw that I had like a knack for writing about hunting and fishing activities. I kind of got wind of the idea that there was a thing called the outdoor writer. Like our home newspaper was Muskegon Chronicle in West Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And they had there was an outdoor columnist who wrote, he would cover some like hunting and fishing news items, like whatever, like the deer herd is up, the deer herd is down. He would report on that. But on Saturdays, there was an outdoor section, and he would write about whatever was going on. If a bunch of yellow perch were coming in from into the inner lakes out of Lake Michigan, he'd write about how guys are catching a lot of yellow perch, whatever. And I had all these other books that I read about how to trap. And there was these writers like this dude, Bob Noonan, and these other guys, and Mike Marziata, these dudes that were writing about trapping. So I felt that to supplement my income as a trapper, I would need to have things that I could do in the summertime. So I started thinking that it would be part of this broader toolkit, right? Or just part of this broader thing that I could like do animal damage control trapping in the off season. Being that like guys that raise sweet corn would have a lot of depredation from raccoons, whatever. If you did like poultry, red fox, groundhogs tearing stuff up, whatever. So there's guys that catch that stuff, or raccoons get in your attic, and you need something to get them out of your attic. I was like, well, I'll fill in with that. I'll fill in by writing articles. And I was trying to piece together how a person would make a living in this discipline. And so that's how I pursued writing, as I pursued it as one of these little things that I could do to try to build up a little pot of money to get through the year.
Yeah. And did you learn the skill through school though? Was it like you went to graduate school and kind of learned how to write, and or were you just naturally good at it too?
Yeah, I was good at a certain kind of writing that I didn't really understand. Like when I was in undergraduate school, I did an English major, but like in college, man, there's not a lot of room for, you get like a major. And you went through school, I'm sure, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So you get a major and it winds up being your major is 2 extra classes. Or, you know what I mean? It's like you're kind of doing all the stuff you're supposed to do. But I did like an English major, and you had to get an emphasis, and I had a practical writing emphasis. So in undergraduate school, you were kind of being trained up to be like the guy that writes the user's manual for a vacuum cleaner.
Okay.
In fact, I was like,
okay.
Oh, okay, that's a good job. Practical writing. But then I got into graduate school, and I got into doing a MFA, and it just wound up being 3 years. It wound up being like you sort of put reality on hold for 3 years and just read and write for 3 years. And I just read and I wrote, I read and I wrote, and I read and I wrote. And I developed and magazines were big back then.
Mm-hmm.
And I became like a real student of magazine writing, like narrative magazine writing, travel writing, right? Adventure writing. I became a student of all that stuff, and I focused on it. And by the time I finished, I was publishing magazine pieces. And that was the heyday. I kind of hit this heyday of magazine writing. Like, you remember people now talking about the .com crash, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah, I remember.
So much but it's kind of funny to think about. So much euphoria about the internet and advertising about websites and e-commerce. But so much of that advertising was pouring into magazines. That magazines were just getting thicker and thicker and thicker as a response to the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Which seems so like contradictory, right? You
yes,
think of
the
internet would shrink it. When the .com crash hit, magazines just shrunk. I remember I was on the masthead for Outside Magazine. I remember like Outside Magazine lost like 75 pages because the ad load dropped off so hard.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But I caught the very end of that. I caught like the glory days of magazine writing. And I remember going to the Philippines, and I had like a travel budget for $10,000, A couple years later, if you got an assignment for something in the Philippines, it'd be like, hey, if you're going anyway, maybe you can write about this. But you used to be able to just go there and like spend money. I went to the Philippines for a month to work on a story, a magazine article. And that world just ended. But then I started doing books.
Right.
But I really caught that magazine writing deal. And it was funny because I always tell people this too. I like hated the internet when the internet came out. I didn't think it was going to do any good for writers. I thought it'd be bad for writers.
It's here to stay no matter what.
I used to think, wish people would get over this stupid internet.
Yeah. Yeah. Not anytime soon, I don't think. So with that, with your books, with American Buffalo specifically, you know, you talk about this sort of chance encounter where you essentially kick this buffalo skull and you pull it out of the earth and you do all this stuff with it and research it. And you're like, you know, I like to tell people, it's like, this buffalo may have been around during the signing of the Declaration of Independence, right?
Mm-hmm. He might have been alive. Yep.
Right. Right. But did you have a fascination with buffalo specifically before that? Did that kind of like spawn this interest for you and like create this whole story around it? It's just that chance encounter?
I was interested, you know, like I was interested in anyone that'd be interested about the West.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that much. In fact, I know so little, in fact, that when I found it, I wasn't entirely sure that's what I was looking at. I figured I was, but I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking at. But man, I got really into that thing.
Yeah.
Really into it. I read everything I could think of. And two things kind of came together. Like I knew I wanted to write a book about the animal, but I just needed more. Like I needed some other thing.
Yeah.
And it wasn't terribly long after I found it that I drew a Copper River buffalo tag up in Alaska. And the minute I drew that tag, I knew I had my book, you know, like the skull wasn't enough. Now looking back on it, it was an easy problem to solve, but I didn't see it the way I see it now. I thought I had to have more. I needed something more. And when I drew that tag, I knew then that even if I didn't get one, you know what I mean? Like I knew then that I had everything I needed for a book because I had a way to bring the story of the animals from the Ice Age to today.
Yeah.
You know, like I didn't want it all just to be about old stuff, right? And there's this really heavily trafficked story about that animal, about the efforts to save it from extinction. It's all great stuff. Like, you know, Ken Burns did a series called The American Buffalo. And I was in that documentary talking about him a bit. And his story really focuses on primarily how we save the animal from extinction.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a kind of a well-trafficked story. So I wanted something that like people didn't really know about. No one knew about, including me for most of my life. Had no idea that there was these animals running around in Alaska that came out of Montana.
Mm-hmm.
That are like out in the bush in Alaska. Like buffalo living and dying without anybody ever looking at them in Alaska.
Yep.
So once I had that whole thing put together, I knew I would have plenty of material for a book.
Yeah. But why that? I mean, okay, beyond that though, why that animal? I mean, because there's all sorts of animals that you hunted and all of that. Like what was it about buffalo that was so interesting?
My buddy right now, Clay, is doing my buddy Clay is mid process and doing a book about the American black bear.
Mm-hmm.
In talking to him, I realized that there's plenty there. Like you can do a book about the American black bear.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure other like great writers could do a book about the white-tailed deer, the cottontail rabbit. I don't know. It's just like I loved animals, and I just within that story found something that was so deep and so complex that I'd never had to worry about there not being enough there.
Yep.
There's enough known about, enough like, and just looking at primary source material, there's just so much about the animal. I just knew there was enough depth to it. And the other thing is it just really captured my imagination. And I found that skull. You know, if I had found a mammoth skull, maybe I would have written American Mammoth. but I wouldn't have had a contemporary part, you
Yeah,
know. But maybe I would have wound up doing a book called American Mammoth, which sounds like a sweet book.
it does. Yeah. Actually, so that makes me think of something like with all these any animal we have now, it seems that the older version, right, like the ancient version of this animal is always bigger. Sometimes way bigger,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Ancient whatever they are, ancient buffalo, tigers, mammoths, sloths, bears, like wolves, everything is bigger. Why is that? Is that because
That's a great point. I never
like
thought about that.
why?
How come we don't read about things that used to be real small?
Right. Yeah. I mean, is there like a
There's got to be some.
there's got to be a reason, but what is it?
There's got to be some name for that. You know what you do see is there's a, it's not the same thing, but it's kind of, it informs what you're talking about a little bit. As you see, there's a field of study called island biogeography. Basically, it's like the study of islands.
Mhm.
The thing you see on islands is that you get small mammals and big reptiles. Just like a little example, like,
Okay.
yeah, you see small versions of mammals and big versions of reptiles.
Huh.
But yeah, it's really funny you say that. And when you look at the Pleistocene extinctions, so our biggest land mammal, the buffalo is the biggest North American land mammal.
Okay.
There was a lot of stuff bigger than them.
Oh yeah. Huge.
They're the biggest that didn't die. You know what I mean?
Yes. Right.
And part of that, like, it seems like at that time, a lot of people look at the demographics of the species and stuff, that they were kind of like not a big deal. They were there, but they weren't in those numbers, It was just another animal on the landscape. And then as all that other stuff, all those other big grazers, those big grassland grazers went away, then you had just poof, they just exploded. They exploded in numbers. But it might not have been like, if somehow magically you could look from back then, you might not have really focused on them too much. It wouldn't have been like, oh, there's 10,000 of those things. It would have been like many other animals on the landscape. But yeah, I have no idea. And I bet you some kind of paleontologist would think of 100 examples of what we're talking about yeah, like why was there a beaver the size of a black bear?
Yeah. And oh my God, I didn't know that. Holy shit.
That's a great question. I'm going to ask a buddy of mine about that. Maybe he can give me some examples of something the other way around. But yeah, it's interesting.
And then is it like, I think most people think that the extinction of most megafauna, in sort of from the Ice Age on or whatever, is because of humans hunting them to extinction. Is that true? Or are there other factors at play there? Like, did we just come in and wipe out every single other than buffalo and some other ones?
If you could answer that, you'd put a lot of people's mind at ease. There's like there's this idea that got floated long ago called the Blitzkrieg hypothesis, and it was these two. I can't remember if one of them was an ecologist and one of them was a model, like did like statistical modeling. I think it was a guy named Martin by the last name of Martin. Either way, the Blitzkrieg hypothesis was this idea that when humans exploded onto the Great Plains, that they wiped out all this wildlife.
Yeah.
That these are things that had, like, the elephant species, right? They had very low fecundity. They were highly susceptible to human predators. They had built up no tolerance for human predators.
Right.
Like, look at like when they brought wolves back into Yellowstone in the late mid 90s. Sorry, that making sense. 96, 97. They bring wolves back in the Yellowstone, and at first the wolves just like basically walk up and help themselves. Do you know what I mean? Like, and elk numbers just right.
Yep.
All of a sudden you reduce the elk herd by 2/3.
Yep.
Because they're like, hey, look at that weird dog, and then all of a sudden, he's got you. And they just couldn't. They took them forever to like figure out how to deal with it. Well, imagine that you're dealing all of a sudden with this very sophisticated human predator. I mean, there's all kinds of problems with the theory, but that was the theory.
Yep.
And I think that really, like, to get a glimpse into how cool that theory is think about a couple things. Is like, according to this understanding, you always had humans in Africa. And you always had elephants in Africa.
That's
But
right. Yes.
humans and elephants coexisted in Africa. So there was never a surprise moment.
Right.
And that winds up being like one of the few places where, they survived in Asia for a while. But these old areas of human habitation keep their elephant populations. Meanwhile, you got these elephants on Wrangel Island in the Bering Sea. And this is what's crazy is those elephants didn't blink out till 4,000 years ago. And guess what? No one showed up on Wrangel Island until 4,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
People didn't find it.
Right.
So you look at like everywhere people would go, they go into Western Europe and the elephants are wiped out from Western Europe.
Australia, right?
Everywhere they go, all the big stuff vanishes. But I think if you were going to like pull if you were going to go get the greatest minds that work on this problem, including a guy, David Meltzer, who's kind of a leading authority on this issue, Dr. David Meltzer from Southern Methodist University, they would be like probably a bunch of things, right? Like probably climate issues,
Mm-hmm.
major climate change, maybe some kind of other weather upheavals, right? Maybe other issues from, Melcher doesn't talk about, but this other guys do, be like issues from asteroid strikes. Something dramatic happened, right? And then on top of that, at a very low point in population, on top of that, you had human predation.
Yeah.
Like
Sure.
maybe there was some around, right? There was a little bit around, and some of the last little pockets got whittled away by people.
Yep.
And that's kind of, like the safest assumption now. But I definitely don't think that it's the end of the story there, because we're always getting new information,
Yeah.
And another thing they keep finding, researchers that look at this, is like, if we're sitting here saying something happened 14,000 years ago, well, think about what you're saying is, think of how big 1,000 years is, right? Like,
Yeah.
you could fit the entire history of the United States of America within a quarter of that.
Right.
So to say all of a sudden 1,000 years ago, it's like, what does
Right.
that really mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I know. The first,
That's
yeah,
a
in
big
fact,
gap
there,
of time.
there was something. Oh, I know. You were talking about sort of like the radiocarbon dating of the skull, where it was like, it was within, I can't remember what it was, like 50 years or 100 years or 200 years or something like that. And you're like, oh man, I wish you could get closer than that. But it's how close you are to that time period, right? When we think of the 1500s, like 200 years is like, oh man, that's so much time. But to your point, if it's 100,000 years ago and it's the difference between 100,000 and 100,200 years, you're like, that's the same thing, right? So it's just the proximity to the
you want to
present.
imagine like it was instant, meaning it's otherwise, I mean, you're not looking at the fact that it's dozens of human generations.
Yes. Yeah.
So we try to look at this little slice, and maybe this thing that seems to like suddenly happen happened over quite some time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like over a length of time that you and me aren't even really equipped to comprehend.
Yeah, for sure. I'm curious how hunting has changed in your lifetime. And I come at this from a very outsider's perspective. I grew up in a place where basically no one hunted. Like, I don't think I knew a single hunter growing up.
Where'd you grow up?
Massachusetts, like suburban Boston, and I'm sure there were people that hunted, don't get me wrong, but it just wasn't a thing there. Like, no one I knew owned even rifles, I don't think. Maybe they did, but it just wasn't a thing. And so, coming from that world, for me specifically, and kind of, now living in Montana and everything, my outsider perspective is it seems like there's a resurgence of hunting. Like, it's much more in the zeitgeist. It may be contentious, if you're going with someone who's like, has moral issues or whatever it may be, but it does seem to be something that has become more prevalent in just sort of like the narrative of people in general. And you're in this world, so I'm curious about your perspective.
I think that's true depending on where you live. You still have you still have very low participation rates in some states, and like pretty high participation rates in some states. I think we have two states. I think California and New Jersey are sub 1%.
Okay.
Less than 1% of the state's population participate, buys a hunting license.
Mhm.
You have other states where, like the state we live in, Alaska, Wyoming, there's certain states that have very high participation rates.
Yep.
If you go back to the post-war years, like the post-World War, when I say post-war, the post-World War II years, you in those years, as like cars are coming into being, freezers become a thing.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of upward mobility, firearms become available. Like in the years following World War II, we kind of create the American outdoorsman, right?
Yep.
Meaning that you can live a suburban existence and get in your car and drive out and participate in hunting and fishing activities.
Yeah.
So you can be like not a farmer and participate in hunting and fishing. You sort of have this creation of the American outdoorsman, which is really became almost like a cultural symbol of the 1950s. What's kind of crazy is, the country's population, I don't know, tripled, quadrupled, something like that since then.
Yeah.
But the number of hunters really hasn't changed that much. I mean, you go back to those years and you had like 9 or 10 million hunters in the country.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the US population does whatever the hell it does. Like I said, triples, quadruples. And then now you have about 13 million hunters. So it's been the number, not the percentage, but the number has been like pretty remarkably static. And every clump of years, every 5, 6, 7 years, whatever it is, we'll see these little uprises in numbers like we saw during COVID, and people will get excited about that. Like, oh, hunting's really taking off. And you'll see these little dips, and people will wring their hands about like, what's happening to hunting? What's happening to all the hunters? And then, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's kind of like remarkable, like if you weren't really into it, if you weren't really into the demographics and interested in the demographics of hunting, you just took like a long view on it and saw a graph, you'd probably be shocked by its stability.
Yeah.
Its stability would probably surprise you. Behaviors have changed though, which creates a feeling of things being different. Like for instance, people are much more inclined of this number of hunters that are out there. People are more inclined to hunt multiple states in a year,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're more inclined to do certain activities, right? So behaviors change, but the actual idea of how many people are out there doing it stays the same. In most recent years, we did see a big spike during a somewhat dramatic spike during COVID. Fishing, hunting really took off, and now you're seeing that tail out as people kind of go back to the normal stuff they're up to. But I think mostly it would wind up being like your perception of it is very informed by where you live and what your peers are doing. And also just for the very basic like thing about the internet is that, and social media is that you can get exposure to a lot of other worlds that you otherwise might not be aware of.
Right. Yeah.
Like I was found out the other day about roller pigeon enthusiasts, right? I never would have known about roller pigeon enthusiasts, but now I know there's a thing called a roller pigeon, and there's people that are really into them.
Yeah.
And so because we
I just learned all about all of that just now from you. I've never heard of any of that stuff. Yeah.
So, I didn't either. I was like, what? So anyways, like you just have ability to be more aware of what everybody's up to, But hunting numbers, it's like the reason people pay so much attention to it and the reason it matters so much is our funding, how we fund wildlife work in the US is wildlife is managed by and large at the state level. Things that are on the endangered species under endangered species protection have federal oversight. And there's some federal oversight on songbirds and migratory birds and things. But generally speaking, wildlife in this country is the property of the state. The state owns the wildlife, and the state is responsible for managing the wildlife. All states have a state wildlife agency. Most of these states' wildlife agencies, many get no hard funding, meaning in the state budget, there is not a big chunk carved out for wildlife. The states get their funding from license holders. They get their funding from people buying tags, stamps, and permits to hunt. Part of the reason when I go hunt in Alaska every year, And I'm like, why is my license, 8 times more expensive than a residence license? Is that states managing their state wildlife can make the decision to charge more for non-residents than they do for residents.
Right.
They're doing that because they're funding wildlife management in that state. So when I said people like wring their hands or get nervous about these downs in hunting, get happy about the ups in hunting, is what that equals is dollars for wildlife. So when you see a dip in hunter numbers, you're seeing a state agency that's looking at their primary funding mechanism dropping. And they're looking at the potential of a revenue decline, right?
Yeah.
That's why these little blips get a lot of attention, because these little blips are like existential threats to state wildlife management, because that's where they get their money. Some states have figured out other stuff, like Missouri has a special funding mechanism when you register vehicles. Some little bit, like pennies per car, but significant, like goes into Missouri's wildlife fund. So other states have other mechanisms, but a lot of states, it's just like they have one way to raise money. They raise money through tags, stamps, and permits. And hunters and anglers foot the bill for wildlife in those states. So when you talk about recruitment, oftentimes that push to recruit or that push to grow hunter numbers is emanating from those state agencies.
Yeah, sure.
Who need to worry about who's paying for wildlife, because we haven't found a better way to do it. And like, just to add one last little thought to it, it winds up that us, like hunters and anglers, wind up being like somewhat territorial, where we have kind of grown to like this funding mechanism because it gives us a huge say. We have an outsized influence on wildlife management in our states because we're like, we pay for it. And we're the ones that tend to get in there and get involved. When you look at other funding structures, you have to get comfortable with the idea that you might have other voices in the room. And we've enjoyed a monopoly on wildlife discussions for a long time.
Yeah.
And that's why, like, a state, like if they start screwing up the deer herd and deer numbers go down, if turkey numbers go down, if walleye numbers go down, they hear about it, right? If monarch butterfly numbers go down, no one's talking about it.
Yeah. So to that point, I mean, if you could wave a magic wand and change hunting, so to speak, that's really broad, obviously, but like change some things about it in the modern world, what would those be? Is it more people hunting? I mean, clearly there's got to be a limit to that. We can't, every single person in the US couldn't be a hunter, but,
no, I always like to point out to people that, well, finish your question.
No. So is it that, is it certain regulations? Is it, I don't know. I mean, like what would you change if you could change things about modern hunting?
Boy, that's a great question that a fellow could take in a bunch of different directions. Sure. But I'll just point out to you really quickly that I pointed out to people that if every American, I don't get this anymore, but I used to, if I was doing interviews with people that were, suspicious of hunting or disapproving of hunting, they'd be like, so you think everyone should go kill a deer? And I'd be like, man, I invite you to look through everything I've ever written and everything I've ever said and find where I said that, because I have never said that.
Right.
And I would point out to people that if every American killed a deer, I think we'd have like a 200 million deer deficit.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. The numbers don't work. So, yeah.
So that's not only is that not going to happen, it can't happen.
Yeah.
I think if I would change a thing, it would be like, if I would change a thing that's actually changeable, let's be constructive. Like, let's be constructive
Sure.
and say like a thing that's actually changeable. I would invite all of those people who participate in hunting and angling, and to a lesser degree fur trappers, but there aren't nearly as many of them, that I would invite hunters and anglers to that everybody would do 50% more, 100% more, whatever I can get away with, that everyone would do a little more to help the resource.
Mm-hmm.
to help the resource. When I say that, it would be mostly like to help habitat. And the way I explain this if I'm trying to explain this to people who are sitting outside of the world of wildlife management, I'll talk about these different perspectives that you can have on wildlife. And I use the analogy of let's use the analogy of an apple tree. Okay. I would say that American hunters or American outdoorsmen, when looking at an apple tree, or when looking at the landscape or the country as an apple tree, they're very focused on the health of the tree, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the tree is taken care of and the tree is watered, the tree is fertilized, right? If the tree is taken care of, it will put off fruit for decades. And they just look at like, how much fruit is it putting off, right? And they want to see that happen. Many people outside of the hunting world and at an extreme, people who are in the animal rights movement are kind of oblivious to the tree. They become very fixated on individual apples, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, that apple there, I don't want anything bad to happen to that apple. I don't want anyone to pick that apple. I don't even want to eat that apple, touch that apple. Don't mess with that apple. I love that apple. And they aren't even thinking about like where that thing came from, right? And that's kind of these two like fundamentally different perspectives of how people perceive wildlife. And we see it all around us. We see someone that, you know, a buddy of mine nearby here, there was a moose that died while it was calving last spring. And someone went out and they covered the moose with a bed sheet and they had a bunch of people over and they had like a ceremony about the moose, right? Very fixated on the apple.
Yes.
Probably pretty oblivious to the tree. You know what I'm saying?
Totally.
And
yep.
so if I was going to like change something, I guess I would want, and I'm not saying they don't. I mean, you know, American hunters are great and American hunters stand up and so many American hunters belong to conservation groups and do habitat work and all that stuff. But like that people would become more aware of the tree, more aware of the apple tree and more worried about the apple tree. And spend a little more mind energy, a little more financial energy and like watching out for the apple tree. I don't think we're ever gonna be sad that we ran out of roads culturally. We're never gonna be like, what happened to all those roads? You know, I think that we're someday gonna be sad that we ran out of apple trees.
Yeah.
That we ran out of habitat. And so learning how to be like really sophisticated about that and knowing that we're gonna have just recognizing there's going to be development, there's going to be resource extraction, right? We're going to have a population that goes up and down. How can we be really strategic about delivering on that or accepting that reality of development and human expansion and being really strategic about identifying, protecting, facilitating the regeneration of the apple tree.
Yeah.
That puts off the stuff. Like I think that's probably like right now one of the most important things that needs to happen, and that people need to pay attention to. And when I say this, I always like to point out, rather than seeming holier than thou, I'll say that I spent the first decades of my life no idea, didn't pay any attention to what I'm talking about. My view about it was I didn't see the tree. And my view was, I'm going to go get as many of those apples as I can before someone else grabs them.
Yeah, sure. Right.
That was how we were raised as hunters and anglers.
Yeah.
It was get it while the getting's good.
And so to that point, does that look like land conservation? Does it look like some kind of climate legislation? Does it look like, you know, controlling the populations in specific ways? What does that look like?
Land conservation.
Land conservation.
Yeah. And like I said, pretty fine-tuned and pretty sophisticated. It's not always like it seems. We need, in a lot of places, in some places, hands off is really good, right? Like 2% of the country is wilderness areas. That's spectacular. We have some experimental wilderness areas that I would love to see be made full-time wilderness areas. That'll probably take some, this I'm talking about the American West right now.
Yeah.
That'll probably take some compromise. Like some of our wilderness areas are going to become, some of our wilderness areas are going to get further protections and some are going to fall off, but like getting as many of these untouched places, but on a smaller scale, or like that's in the West. In the East, it's like, it's things like the Farm Bill, active forest management. A lot of people have this idea that the woods is best left alone. In a lot of places, we need to be doing like very active management. Like habitat gets built. You know, a lot of people have the idea that habitat comes from just leaving stuff alone. In a lot of places, we need to build and rebuild habitat.
Okay.
Through timber management and other things. So it's like you can't, it's farm practice, it's timber management practice, it's land conservation, it's conservation easements. It's like it's many things all over the place. The best way to find out how to be impactful in your own area is like look at where you participate, look at where you hunt and fish, and find out how to be effective in your pocket. It could be, if it's in the Southeast, it could be burning. Controlled burns could be the best habitat thing that could be happening in the Southeast. If you're in the Midwest, you know, it could be thinning. Actually, cutting trees is the best thing for habitat, right? In some areas, it could be mowing down junipers to regenerate grasslands in arid country in the West. It's always different. You know, I mean, there's no, it's like it takes a hyper localized sensibility to find out how to be impactful where you live, because there's no two places the same.
Yeah. Is that because we've already screwed around with these places in the first place, though? Right? Because certainly, if there were no humans on the planet, nature would just sort itself out, right? Like nature is just nature, and it would be. So is that because
like, you know, you hear people say there's no putting the genie back in the bottle,
right?
You know, we are the number. I mean, you know, it's like it's so obvious. You know, no one don't want to say it, but like we remade the landscape.
Yeah, right.
It's too late to walk away now.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. It's too late to walk away now. Now
right.
It's like, that's why people use this term like active management, meaning management isn't standing back. In a lot of places, if you stand back, you know what you wind up with? A big patch of weeds. If you stand back, it's a disturbed landscape. It just goes to weeds.
Yes.
It's like active land management is what we need in so many places. And that's the kind of thing where it takes a pretty nuanced understanding of your landscape to start seeing beyond these simplifications, like people are bad, and start seeing that people can be very helpful on wildlife.
Yeah. So tangential question to that. There's a chapter, just sort of like the ethics of hunting. There's a chapter in MeatEater, I think it's called Proper Killing. And I found this, it's almost when you're writing that, I almost feel like you're sort of thinking through it in real time a little bit as I was reading that, because it's a question, even not coming from a hunting perspective, that I've always kind of thought about in that realm, which is like, what's the line of fairness in hunting, right? Because, right? Like, where is that line? Because I think of it like, okay, if we're going to be the fairest possible, it's like, you're just going to run after an animal and try to wrestle it to the ground with your bare hands and kill it that way. But that's just a fight, right? And so as soon as you sort of have an advantage, like what makes it hunting in my mind is, okay, you have some advantage. You're taking on an advantage, a rifle, a weapon of some sort, the ability to, you know, binoculars, whatever it may be. And the question is, how many advantages are you going to stack in your favor before it becomes unethical, right? Before you've penned in the animal, it's got nowhere to go, whatever it may be. And that's a hard question, I think, to figure out what that is, right? And by the way, just to close out this thought, is like, you know, coming from a military background, like when you're going into combat, you're trying to get as many unfair advantages as possible. That's the whole point, right? I'll take every unfair advantage. I want the element of surprise. I want night vision. I want planes overhead. Like I want every single advantage to keep us alive and kill our enemies if we need to. Right? That's the whole point. But the thing you bring up in there is, but you're not like hunting. These are not enemies, right? Like we care about the conservation here. So I just think it's a really interesting question. I'm curious where you stand on this.
My feelings about this evolve so much. And what drives that evolution is traveling to more places and getting more exposure to other cultures, even within the US. I realize now that I have fallen into a trap in years past that other people fall into, where we tend to look at the behaviors and methods that we used growing up as being the sort of gold standard,
Mm-hmm.
and other things are abnormal. Okay. And I started to recognize that when I came up against people who would look at activities that I grew up with and that are totally ethically acceptable, and had people look and say, like, well, that's not sportsmanlike. And I would think, well, what do you know? Like, you've never been out doing that. You have no idea what you're talking about. It's
Right.
really hard. It's really hard. And I used to think that of like what people did in some areas. I think like, oh, that's not fair what they do. And then they would look at me and they'd be like, that's not fair what he does. And it's because we're tribalist, right? We
Yep.
like, we have our activities. Oops, sorry. We had people where we're like, our activities are normal and everybody else's activities are abnormal. And a lot of really good hunting philosophers have looked at this question. And there's one, it's not perfect, but it came from, oh man, please don't tell me I can't think of this guy's name. He passed away some years ago. He lived in Montana. Jim Posowitz was his name.
Okay.
He was like a philosopher of hunting. And he came pretty close, and I should spend more time thinking about it, because he talked about, is the outcome known or unknown when you go in the woods?
Mm-hmm. It's unknown.
You know? Yeah. And he's like, perhaps as we think about what is fair chase and what is ethics in hunting, and again, this isn't my line, and I could argue it and shoot holes in it from various directions, but it was kind of, he was picking at something interesting where he's like, let's keep the technologies and things, let's govern those technologies in order to make sure that when we go out in the woods, the outcome is unknown. Because that's what we're really after. That's the thrill, is the unknown outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you use the combat parallel. You don't want to go into, like, every time you go to a target, you don't want to wonder, is the unknown whether I leave here alive or not?
Right.
And that's the
No,
fun. That's not the fun.
Right. We're trying to reduce uncertainties as many as much as possible. Yeah. Yes.
But like, and he says, he sort of invites you to be like, what is so exciting about getting up early in the morning and going out? You don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
Like, that's the beauty of it. And if we get to a point with technology and other advantages, if we get to the point where we go out, we just know what's going to happen. Then he's like, then I think we lost something.
Yeah. I love that insight. I had not thought of it in those terms, but that's a really good way to frame it.
And he felt that's what you're chasing. You're chasing the unknown. And he like, you know, and he wrote about this and talked about it. But you know what I got to do, and I hate to do, is I got to pick up my wife from the airport.
Yeah. I know we're over time here, so we'll wrap it up here, man. So look, thanks for being on. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate coming on. I'm sad that I didn't be more brief in my answers, so that I wouldn't need.
Oh no, this is great. This is great, man. So, and when's the show on? History Channel.
The third episode, Tuesdays on History Channel, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 Central, 8 Mountain.
Cool. I'm going to check it out for sure. It's right up my alley. And
please do, man. I hope you enjoy it.
I wasn't able to ask what's up with cattle mutilation, so I'm looking forward to learning about it on the show.
Watch the episode.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah,
thanks.
I went into that thinking I had it all figured out, but it's actually a rich subject of inquiry, man. Appreciate you asking.
I'm sure it is. Thanks, Steve. Really appreciate it.
Thanks,
man.
dude. Appreciate it.
See ya. Thanks for listening to On the X, the official podcast of the Navy SEAL Foundation and an Ironclad original series, sponsored by Mechanics Wear. Learn more at NavySealFoundation.org or text On the X to 60104. See you next time.